Hi, this is Rich Seiling, and we're here today for another in my series of example videos where we go into one of my photographs and look at the actual techniques that I used in Photoshop to make it into a print that is a beautiful fine art print. Today we're looking at one of my black and white photographs, and this is of Bridal Veil Falls in Yosemite Valley, taken from the turnout right when you come in the road on Highway 41 where everybody stops and takes pictures. And this happened to be a really great day to be there and just enjoy Yosemite and take a picture. And it's one of my favorite black and white photographs. This is taken with film. I made it in about 1997, and this is actually about midday. The storm had been going and took off for a nice drive around the valley and to see what was going on. Wound up here at Tunnel View, happened to be pretty gorgeous, and made this photograph. It's made on T-Max 100 4x5 film, which since I've started using 4x5 has been my film of choice for nearly 2 decades. And in this digital age, it's kind of interesting what we can do with film in a drum scanner. So I want to talk about the scanning process a little bit. You can see that this is the typical flat scan that I like working with. And it's flat not because I'm purposely doing something to make it flat, but I'm taking the way the scanner naturally wants to capture this data and modifying it in Photoshop instead of working heavy on the camera or on the scanner side. And one of the reasons for doing that is in Photoshop, I can make changes on these layers that I can go back and change at any time without having to rescan. But on Scanner, if I make a radical change, there's really a lot of changes you can make on Scanner that you can't undo in Photoshop. So I don't want to add anything that I might want to undo later at that step. And this has proven a great workflow for over 12 years. So we've got a great workflow in this. That's the way I approach it. And we run into some other interesting things with black and white. With black and white film, we record information just simply as density. And where there's more density in the film are highlight areas, where there's less are shadow areas. And in traditional black and white photography, where we print this in the darkroom, we're limited by what density values, how those translate onto exposure with photographic paper. But in the digital realm, the paper is the scanner, and the scanner can see a much wider depth of detail out of all these density ranges than photographic paper can. In fact, I think you can get up to 15 stops of information out of a black and white negative using the techniques that I've used on the Tango drum scanner. So this is kind of the original HDR. Ansel even came up with the original HDR if you really want to look into it, which is kind of cool. But there's a lot of information here. And the big thing is, and that's another reason this is looking flat, which is why I'm explaining this, is the scanner can see detail into dense highlight areas that frankly would just be called bulletproof in the darkroom, that you wouldn't get any detail out of them. I've seen the scanner pull detail out of that. Is it the best detail? Well, yes and no, but there is detail there, and there are ways you can make it workable. And similarly, in the shadows, I've seen negatives that literally to the eye show no density in areas. On a densitometer, you can see that there's density, but to the naked eye, it essentially looks like clear film, and the scanner pull out a full range of tones from shadow areas that would be simply unrecoverable in the darkroom. And it's really an amazing thing. So when I'm taking a negative, like this negative was photographed using the zone system, intended for printing in the darkroom. So I'm trying to capture the tonal ranges in a range that works well with photographic paper. And that's still the method I use, even though I don't print in the darkroom at this time. That range of values almost is slightly compressed on the drum scanner, because the drum scanner can see out so much further, and that's adding to this flat look as well. But like I've talked about in my other videos and we're going to see here, it's very easy to take that and turn it into a fantastic product that expresses the full tonal ranges of the photograph. So I think that's enough on scanning for now. Let's look at what made this happen. And if you look over here, this is just a 3-layer photograph. With black and white, certainly things are simplified because we're not dealing with color balance. at least if you're printing a pure grayscale. We're not dealing with saturation of colors. We're not having to look at, is this a little too yellow, a little too magenta, the normal color biases within a photograph. We're not worried about if our grass is green. We're simply looking at relationships between black and white and all the grays in between. And really black and white photography is about all the steps of gray in between that we're looking at. So if we look at our curve layers here, you can see we've got curve 1, curve 2, curve 3, pretty basic progression. And I'm just going to walk you through what happened on here. First layer that I put on here was a curves layer for overall density control. Let's open this up. And this is, again, you'll see I use these S curves that lift the highlights and create a shoulder that controls the tonal relationship of those highlights and how they fall off, how they move into that brightness. And these are critical areas in the highlights where little moves in tonal value or in pixel value create big changes on what it looks like in the print, because we're reaching the limits of what can be displayed before you reach paper white. And down here in the shadows, again, we have the opposite curve of that. We're creating the toe of this, which controls where things are mapped into black. And on this particular image, because the scanner can see so deep into this, and it's it's a pretty flat scene. I mean, look at this. This is snow and clouds, snow still falling in a snowstorm. There probably wasn't a pure black even in the negative. So we're bringing one back in, and I did that by both moving the end point, but then also putting a point on here for control of what that shape is. Because if that's just a linear line, it's not going to have the same nice progression of those shadows, the same detail, the same tactileness. That's what we're used to looking at in black and white shadows, as it will when I put this point on and have a shoulder. And really, this gets to the heart of making photography in the digital darkroom work. Sensitometry, which is something if you want to dig into, if you're one of the analog guys like me, you're probably familiar with, is really still the foundation of what's going on in photography. It's sensitometry basically describes the progression of tonal relationships and how they're mapped. We just used to do it analog because a curve like this was built into photo paper in the past. We just didn't see it unless we did a test with a step wedge to measure it out. Where now in Photoshop we actually see this curve and we can influence it very greatly compared to the controls we had in the darkroom. We're essentially making our own grade 5.2.5 photo paper if we want, or anything in between. So we have tremendous flexibility, but that also can be a little scary sometimes. But look at what I'm doing here. Not that scary. I'm just reacting to what I see. The blacks weren't black enough, so I moved my endpoint. I know that I like some snap in the highlights, and that's what that separation gives it, some snap and tactileness. So that's what that did, and this for the shadows. So looked at the curve. Let's see what it does. You can see immediately pretty big transforming character on this photograph. And the things I'm looking to do here is standing here, if you've ever been to Yosemite, where you're looking at least about a mile or so difference between where we're standing here with these trees right in front of us and where Bridal Veil Fall is. It might actually be even a little bit further, but there's a large sense of space. And over here we have El Capitan, and in the background Half Dome, which is approximately 7 or 7.5 miles away. There's an immense feeling of space, like few other places you're going to experience on the planet that you can just drive to without doing a monstrous hike to get up to. So that's a feeling that makes this feel real to me that I need to preserve. And keeping this veil over Bridal Veil of snow and fog and clouds, while having this foreground be strong and bold, helps create that separation and sense of depth. So some of these things happen intuitively when you're printmaking, and it's easier to talk about later. But I find the more that I can understand them while I'm printing, they lead me to make the decision with the tool, because the tool is, sometimes it can just be purely visual. I know this looks right, but sometimes it's, well, what visual do I want to achieve? And that's based on this cognitive understanding of what you were trying to express in the photograph. So there's no right or wrong way, but the more you can understand your photographs and what you want to achieve, the more I think it always makes it easier to print them. So just flip it on and on again. You can see that immediately by blackening these tree trunks and bringing in that feeling of shadow and darkness, we create some separation and we create that veil between the two. Now, this isn't too bad, but as I looked at it and, whenever I'm looking at the screen, I'm also considering what it's going to look like on the printer, because as good as calibrated and profiled monitors are, they're still not perfect. And it all depends what your standard is. They're really good up to a really high standard, but for fine art printing, where we're looking for that last ounce of expression of what we feel inside, the monitor doesn't match what the print will show. And the print has to be our ultimate guide. And I find particularly black and white printmaking with the digital darkroom is much more similar to printing in the darkroom than color photography is. In fact, you even have to proof sometimes at full sizes, and proofing at 8x10 can hide tonal relationships that are going on, and there's a little bit more of the proofing, looking at the proof and making corrections, just like would happen in the darkroom, than there would be with a color photograph. But it still works out pretty easy and you get pretty amazing results. But I just kind of want to shatter one of those myths that, oh, it's just what you see is what you get and it's going to work out, and make an 8x10 proof you love, and then when you make the 20x24 it's going to look exactly like that too. Well, no. I make an 8x10 proof I love, and then I make a proof at size and see if it still holds up. And often I'm making changes instead of one master file that I print every size from, which I do in color routinely. In black and white, often I have master files for different size groupings, and sometimes what made this 8x10, I'll have to make a separate file for the 1620 2024 print, and maybe even at 2436 or 3040 it might require something different because of the scale that it's being displayed on, the relationships that creates. So be aware of that. You don't have to take any action on that, but just don't, when you come up with the surprise of, hey, I made the 1620 and it doesn't look like my little proof, now you have the answer ahead of time. So global layer, global curve layer, same thing I'm doing on color photographs is the same thing I do on black and white photographs there. Pretty straightforward. Then with black and white, our tools are dodging and burning, which is basically selective lightening and darkening of specific areas within the photograph. And doing this, certainly it's much easier to replicate complex dodges and burns in the darkroom, or here in the digital darkroom, than it is in the physical darkroom, but we're doing the same kind of things. And that was my next choice, is as much as I like the blacks that were brought in to this foreground area, I want that area to be a little bit lighter feeling, in the feeling of snow. So we've got a curve here, and it's a little bit, the way we're doing that is through contrast. So what I did is, it's two parts here. Let's go to our channels and look at our mask. I created a mask just of this foreground area that is the trees and part up into the significant trunk area of this photograph. And this was simply just created by taking the lasso tool, following along the tree line such as I wanted, and then using refine edges, because Photoshop changed the way this works forever to my dismay, and we feather down here how much we want that spread to be, and then we click it OK, and then from there we can make a new curves layer, and that mask is automatically put on that curves layer. So I'm going to cancel that. We don't really want to use that layer, but that's how we got to that mask. And just basic dodging and burning. In the darkroom I would have done this with a big card, and a card kind of linearly covering this area, and maybe my finger or some other tool trying to cover that area as I moved it around frantically during the exposure, with split neutral density. Because also what we're doing here, let's look at this curve. I'm not just dodging and burning with density of make it lighter or darker. I'm also dodging and burning with contrast. So we get a selective contrast dodge and burn in here. And what you can see is I'm pulling the shadows down slightly, But what I'm really doing the most work on is the highlights. I'm lifting them up to brighten the whites in there because they already start off a little flat. Let's look at the numbers there. And I like to read things in RGB numbers just because that's how I worked for so long that it's intuitive to me, but I'll put up the lab numbers so you can see the percentage in here. But look at this beautiful white snow. Well, it's 210 and it's an 84 luminance. You know, that's not quite the brightest white. That has some gray components into it, and especially when you get down here into the shadowed snow, it's only a 75% or 187 on the RGB values. So my first curve put some more lightness in there. 237, we saw 230, 230, 90%, 209. Well, the paper that I print on and the way I print lets me get values on paper that are even higher values than what we showed there. And that's what this curve is, pushing that up into those brighter values. I both want to make it brighter so it seems really bright white and gives that feeling of pure snow, because when you're in a snowy scene like this, where your eye is white balancing and setting what's the brightest thing in the scene on this snow, it has a really strong impact of snow. So that's what we're trying to do here. And this curve is doing that. You can see now we're pushing the brighter areas around 245, some a little higher. And that's getting into the realm where it gets harder and harder to make separations on the printed piece between values. So we're pushing up against the highlights there. And even the shadow values are much higher. So I've brightened that area up with this curve. Pretty basic from the look of it, but it does have a significant impact on the printed image. And then thirdly, we added a third curve, and this is where we throw in a little bit of a curveball of the simple method. So far it's been really simple, and here it's not completely not simple, but we add an extra tool that the more fluent you are in masking, the more you're able to play with these tools. And we're going to look at what that is. Let me turn on this. What I really wanted to do is bring out more of the lightness feeling of looking into these trees. Without this curve, you can see it's kind of dark and heavy, and while I've created that separation between these two planes of what's in the distant background and what's in the immediate foreground, it's just very heavy down in these trees, and I didn't like the way that looked. And so I wanted to lift them up. I still wanted a black point, but I wanted to lift up that detail so that there was just this bright, airy look that was really before me in the way that I saw it when I looked at this scene, and the way it's just what I want to express here. So let's look at this. First of all, a curve. See another big S curve. I'm really not doing much with the shadows. This point is here more just to constrain what this did when it moved everything off. And I'll just show you that really quick. See, if we don't have that point, it starts pushing the shadows up and also not having the nice tonal relationships that we want. So like cancel, we'll just bring that back. So that point is there just to constrain the shadows from what I did to the highlights. And I'm just further lifting up not just the highlights, even though this point, you see the big curve here on the highlights, also the midtone value. Right here's the midtone, and you can see I've shifted this to a much brighter value. The input value was 99. I've outputted at 129. So there's a big push that's happened from that. It's really been lightened quite a bit. So that, let's just zoom in as well and look at what that did. It really brightened up these dark centers of the trees. But there's a catch. You can see how much a move I made on the highlights. What this should have done is taken all these bright, wonderful areas of snow on the trees and blown it out. And in fact, that's what it did. So I had to make a modification to this mask. First, let's look at the mask. And this was just selective. What I did is I made a mask and I made the curve. I filled the layer with black, and then I started to paint in the areas where I wanted brightness to be come in. And you can see my little strokes here where I've just gone through and it's literally painting it just in as I made the dodging and burning. And that's another way we can build these masks. But there's also something else you're seeing in here. Here's the snow hummocks. as I did it, I obviously saw, okay, wow, this is great for these shadow areas of the trees, but it's blowing out the snow that landed on the branches and the brightest areas of snow. So I need to block the effect of this layer from those areas. So I'm going to just show you quickly what I did. Clicking on the background layer, that's important because that's what's going to where our data is. I'm going to use the color range tool, and I get this from right clicking. There's a couple ways to get to it. I'm going to choose color range. And the interesting thing is color range, even though it's called color range, it's basically picking things on a certain density value or a certain numeric value. So it still works in black and white. Here we're turning it into the black and white range tool. And yeah, this is going to be a little easier if we show what we select against a black mat. You can see here, I've just selected the snow areas here, and you're seeing it against black. The areas I've selected are showing up as white. So with the color range tool, I'm able to just select those snowy hummocks, and I'm going to click OK. And now what I can do is I go back to this curves layer, and if I use the paintbrush tool, let's paint black, let's get a nice big brush that's going to have some effect, and let's choose an opacity of 50%, and I'm going to Command H to hide what's going on there. You know, this may not be the best way to show it. Let's look at it a different way. There we go. Let's go back in the history here really quick with our paintbrush. What happens is I'm painting in only the area. Ah, history jumped me all around. That happens sometimes when you're playing around in history. So I'm painting in only the areas that were selected, which are those snowy hummocks, and I could go through and visually just paint down the areas that were too bright and had the highlights where they just literally went off the scale and lost that tonal value that's giving them the separation, the delicate feeling of whites. So I just went through and visually, not here, but back on the way I was showing before, painted those down. And that's why we're not seeing the effect, is because I've already painted them down. But I'm making a very selective mask within the mask that I already created. So we're using two masking techniques here to combine them and use it to block that. And this is, for anybody that is familiar with ilfochrome printing, this is basically similar to making a highlight mask in ilfochrome. Well, I'm just doing it selectively here within another layer. Now let's go back to the history and just undo all our great changes that we've made here. And that allowed me to protect those areas so that I could still lighten the shadows but not blow out the highlights. And that's what resulted in this final photograph. 3 layers, mostly a global change, one simple dodge and burn with contrast, and one little bit more complicated dodge and burn with this technique then of highlight masking thrown on top just for good measure. So not very complicated. Hopefully, once again, we're showing that simple tools can produce extraordinary results, and fine art printing is really simple. I hope you like this video. I hope it brings about some great growth in your black and white printmaking and brings about new areas of discovery, because I'm as excited about black and white printmaking in the digital realm as I am in color, and these are just fantastic tools that I hope this has given you greater insight into. Thanks for watching today, and we'll see you next time on Crafting Photographs with our example videos.